In the year 2226, in a settlement called the Boneyard within the territory of the New California Republic, a child was born who would become one of the most feared and controversial figures in the post-war wasteland. His name was Edward Sallow, and nothing about his early life suggested he would transform himself into Caesar, the self-proclaimed son of Mars, founder of an empire built on slavery, conquest, and the deliberate rejection of everything the post-war world had tried to build. This is the story of Caesar's legion. But before there was a legion, before the red banners and the bull insignia, and the armies of slaves marching under Roman standards, there was simply Edward, a boy raised by idealists who believed education and peace could heal the wasteland, who would eventually conclude that only brutal autocracy and merciless discipline could save humanity from itself. The followers of the apocalypse were, and remain, one of the wasteland's most unusual organizations. Unlike the military brotherhoods or merchant guilds or tribal confederations that emerged from the Great War's ashes, the followers were intellectuals, educators, healers. They believed that civilization's collapse had been caused by ignorance, violence, and the abandonment of learning. Their solution was to preserve and spread knowledge, to teach anyone who would learn, to provide medical care and education freely to communities that had forgotten what schools and hospitals were. The Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, served as one of their primary centers. It was a harsh place to grow up, radiation-scarred, filled with desperate survivors, and the remnants of pre-war infrastructure too damaged to use, but too massive to ignore. But for a child raised among the followers, it was also a place of unexpected privilege. The followers maintained libraries, actual collections of pre-war books that had survived the nuclear fire. They taught reading, writing, mathematics, history, languages. They believed that understanding the old world was essential to building something better from its ruins. Edward Sallow thrived in this environment. He demonstrated from an early age an exceptional gift for languages. Where other students struggled to master one tongue, Edward absorbed multiple languages with ease that amazed his teachers. He learned Latin from pre-war texts, studied tribal dialects, absorbed linguistic patterns and structures with the kind of natural facility that suggested genuine genius in this particular domain. But Edward's interests went beyond mere language acquisition. He read voraciously, consuming everything the followers' libraries contained about ancient history, particularly about Rome. The Roman Republic and Empire fascinated him. The military organization, the expansion from a single city to dominion over the known world, the transformation of diverse peoples into a unified civilization. He studied Caesar's Gallic Wars, read about the Punic Wars, absorbed accounts of how Rome had conquered, assimilated, and transformed the Mediterranean world. To most followers, this was simply academic interest, the kind of historical study they encouraged. Ancient civilizations offered lessons about what had worked and what had failed, insights that might help the wasteland avoid repeating pre-war mistakes. But in Edward's mind, something different was forming. He wasn't just studying Rome as history, he was studying it as a model, a blueprint for power that had proven successful in transforming tribal chaos into organized civilization. The followers, dedicated to their mission of spreading knowledge and healing, regularly sent expeditions into the wasteland to study tribal cultures, provide medical assistance, and establish educational outposts. These missions were dangerous. The wasteland beyond NCR protection was filled with raiders, mutated creatures, environmental hazards. But the followers considered them essential to their purpose. How could they help rebuild civilization if they didn't understand the people living beyond their shelters? In 2246, when Edward Sallow was 20 years old, the followers organized an expedition to the Grand Canyon region. The area was home to numerous tribes that had minimal contact with NCR territory, people who had developed their own post-war cultures in relative isolation. The followers wanted to study these tribes, document their languages and customs, and potentially establish peaceful contact that might eventually bring them into the broader network of wasteland communities. Edward was chosen for this expedition, along with two other followers. Joshua Graham, a missionary from New Canaan with extensive experience in tribal territories, and a physician named Calhoun, who would provide medical services and study tribal health practices. It seemed like a standard followers' expedition, dangerous but valuable, the kind of mission they regularly undertook in their effort to reconnect the scattered remnants of humanity. Edward approached the mission with his characteristic intellectual intensity. He prepared by studying what little information existed about the Grand Canyon tribes, learning fragments of their languages, reading about the region's pre-war history. Joshua Graham, older and more experienced, would handle navigation and security. Calhoun would manage medical matters. Edward's role was primarily as linguist and cultural observer. His job was to communicate, to document, to understand. The expedition left NCR territory and headed east, following old pre-war highways when possible, navigating wasteland terrain when necessary. It took weeks to reach the Grand Canyon region, weeks of travel through increasingly harsh desert, past abandoned towns and scattered settlements, into territory where the NCR's presence was minimal and tribal authority was absolute. They made contact with several smaller tribes initially, groups that were curious but cautious about these strangers from the West. Edward's linguistic abilities proved valuable. He could learn basic communication quickly, could demonstrate the followers' peaceful intentions, could explain their mission in ways that tribal leaders could understand. It seemed to be going well. And then they encountered the Blackfoot tribe. The Blackfoots were not a large tribe by wasteland standards, but they were aggressive, territorial, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. They had been at war with neighboring tribes for years, locked in cycles of raid and counter-raid that kept all the regional tribes weak, poor, and focused on simple survival. The Blackfoots saw the followers' expedition not as an opportunity for cultural exchange, but as a potential resource. Hostages who might be ransomed, slaves who could be sold, or simply victims who could be killed to prevent them from aiding enemy tribes. The three followers were captured. It happened quickly, overwhelmingly. One moment they were approaching a Blackfoot settlement under signs of peace. The next, they were surrounded by armed warriors who saw no reason to respect the customs of distant organizations they had never heard of. The followers' equipment was seized. They were bound, held under guard, while Blackfoot leaders debated what to do with them. Calhoun didn't survive long. The exact circumstances vary in different accounts, but whether through illness, execution, or simply the harsh conditions of captivity, the physician died within the first few weeks. Edward and Joshua Graham were left alive, valuable enough to keep as potential ransom, but not valuable enough to warrant particularly gentle treatment. For most people, capture by a hostile tribe deep in wasteland territory, far from any hope of rescue, would mean death or enslavement. But Edward Sallow, confronted with this crisis, saw something else. He saw opportunity. The Blackfoots were strong enough to capture the followers, but they were also clearly struggling. They were at war with multiple neighboring tribes. Their warriors were brave but poorly organized, fighting as individuals rather than as a coordinated force. They had weapons but no real tactics, courage but no discipline. They won some fights through superior numbers or individual skill, but they lost others, and the constant warfare was bleeding them dry. Edward had spent his entire life reading about military history, studying how armies were organized, how empires were built. The followers had given him access to pre-war military manuals, tactical guides, historical accounts of how small, disciplined forces had defeated larger but less organized enemies. And more than that, he had absorbed the lessons of Rome, how a single city had conquered tribes far more numerous by imposing organization, discipline, and strategic thinking on warfare that others approached as individual combat. The Blackfoots had a problem. Edward had the knowledge to solve it. And in that gap between their need and his capability, Edward saw the possibility of transformation, not his rescue, but his elevation. He began speaking to his captors, using the fragments of their language he had learned and expanding his vocabulary daily. He offered them something: knowledge of warfare, tactics that could let them defeat their enemies, organization that would transform them from a struggling tribe into a dominant force. It wasn't framed as a bargain for his freedom. That would have shown weakness. Instead, Edward presented it as an opportunity for the Blackfoots to become something greater than they had ever imagined. Whether the Blackfoot leaders believed him initially or simply found it amusing to let their educated captive play at being a warrior, they gave him a chance. Edward, drawing on military manuals and historical accounts, began teaching Blackfoot warriors to fight as a unit. He introduced basic Roman military tactics, the testudo formation for defense, coordinated movements, the concept of officers giving orders that warriors followed without question. The transformation wasn't immediate. Tribal warriors were used to fighting as individuals, earning personal glory through individual combat. The idea of subordinating yourself to unit cohesion, of following orders rather than seeking individual opportunities for heroism, ran counter to everything their culture valued. Many warriors resisted, saw it as cowardice or an insult to their martial traditions. But then, the Blackfoots, organized according to Edward's tactical instructions, fought a battle against a rival tribe. And they won. Not barely, not through luck or superior numbers, but decisively. Warriors who had fought as an organized unit, following commands and maintaining formation, devastated enemies who fought in the traditional individual style. The victory was so one-sided that even the most skeptical Blackfoot warriors had to acknowledge that Edward's methods worked. More victories followed. Tribes that the Blackfoots had been fighting to stalemates for years were suddenly being defeated, their warriors killed or captured, their territories claimed. With each success, Edward's status within the Blackfoot tribe rose. He was no longer a hostage or even just an advisor. He was becoming essential, the source of power that was transforming the Blackfoots from one tribe among many into the dominant force in the region. Joshua Graham, the other surviving follower, adapted to these circumstances by becoming Edward's right hand. Graham was a devout Mormon from New Canaan, a man of deep faith and considerable physical courage. Where Edward provided strategic thinking and organizational vision, Graham provided tactical leadership and the ability to inspire warriors in combat. He learned to speak multiple tribal languages fluently, became expert in wasteland survival and warfare, transformed himself from a missionary into a military commander. The partnership between Edward and Joshua was powerful and, initially, surprisingly functional. Edward's intellectual brilliance, combined with Joshua's practical capabilities and leadership skills, created a command structure that could both plan campaigns and execute them effectively. They complemented each other, covering each other's weaknesses while amplifying their strengths. But Edward was changing in fundamental ways that went beyond simply adapting to circumstances. He had entered Blackfoot territory as a follower of the apocalypse, a believer in the organization's ideals of peace, education, and gradual cultural improvement. He had believed, or at least accepted, that the wasteland could be healed through knowledge, that teaching people to read and providing medical care would eventually create the conditions for civilization to re-emerge organically. His captivity shattered those beliefs. Edward had watched the followers' peaceful approach fail completely. They had been captured, Calhoun had died. Their ideals had counted for nothing against tribal violence. And he had seen, in contrast, how military organization and tactical superiority had succeeded. The Blackfoots hadn't been convinced to change through education or moral persuasion. They had changed because Edward gave them power, and power was the only argument that mattered in the wasteland. This realization transformed Edward's worldview. The followers were wrong. Democracy, as the NCR was attempting, was wrong. The entire post-war approach of trying to rebuild the old world's political structures was doomed to create weak, corrupt societies that would eventually collapse back into chaos. What the wasteland needed wasn't freedom or education or gradual improvement. It needed absolute authority, ruthless discipline, and a leader willing to impose order regardless of the cost. And Edward, studying his Roman texts in the moments between campaigns, found his model and his identity. He would be Caesar, the transformative autocrat who had ended the Roman Republic and created the empire. The tribes he conquered would be welded into a legion, a military society organized along Roman lines, but adapted to wasteland realities. And he would do what Caesar had done: create a civilization through conquest, impose unity through force, and build an empire that would outlast the weak democratic experiments that would inevitably fail. In 2247, 1 year after the followers' expedition had been captured, Edward Sallow died and Caesar was born. He declared it formally, taking the name and the title, demanding that the Blackfoots and the tribes they had conquered recognize him not as an advisor or war leader, but as absolute sovereign. He renamed the Blackfoots and their conquests as Caesar's Legion, organized them into Roman-style units with Latin titles and ranks, and began the systematic project of erasing tribal identities in favor of legion unity. The transformation was total and deliberate. Conquered tribes were forced to abandon their languages, Only Latin and a simplified wasteland English were permitted. Tribal customs, religions, and cultural practices were suppressed. Even personal names were often replaced with Latin equivalents or simply discarded in favor of legion designations. The goal was to destroy tribal identity completely, to create individuals who thought of themselves only as legionaries, whose loyalty was to Caesar and the legion, rather than to any pre-conquest heritage. This cultural annihilation served a strategic purpose. Caesar had studied enough history to understand that empires built on conquered peoples face constant problems of loyalty and rebellion. If conquered tribes retained their identities, they would eventually seek independence. But if those identities could be erased, if a new generation could be raised knowing only legion culture, then the conquered would become genuinely loyal rather than merely subjugated. The method was brutal but effective. Children of conquered tribes were separated from their families and raised in legion camps, taught Latin and legion ideology, trained as warriors who knew nothing except obedience to Caesar. Women were enslaved, reduced to chattel whose purpose was labor and producing the next generation of legionaries. Men who resisted were crucified, slowly, publicly, left to die over days as warnings to others. Those who submitted were incorporated into the legion's ranks, given the chance to prove their loyalty through service and combat. Caesar's ideology, forming fully in these early years, held that weakness was the enemy of civilization. The old world had been destroyed by its weakness. Moral weakness that led to decadence, military weakness that led to defeat, ideological weakness that led to corruption. The NCR, in Caesar's view, was simply repeating those failures. Their democracy was a system that elevated the weak and mediocre, that allowed individual rights to interfere with collective strength, that would inevitably collapse as the Roman Republic had collapsed. The legion would be different. It would be strong because it was ruthless, unified because it tolerated no division, successful because it valued victory over all other considerations. Caesar saw himself as a necessary tyrant, the founder who would create something sustainable through methods that softer, weaker leaders would refuse to employ. He expected to be hated and feared, and he counted those reactions as proof that he was doing what needed to be done. Joshua Graham, now bearing the title of Malpais Legate, commander of Caesar's military forces, led the legion's expansion through the late 2240s and into the 2250s. The Malpais Legate became legendary in the tribes of Arizona and Utah, a figure of terror who appeared leading legion cohorts, who spoke multiple languages and understood tribal customs well enough to exploit them, who combined tactical brilliance with absolute commitment to Caesar's vision. Under Graham's military leadership and Caesar's strategic direction, the legion swept through the Grand Canyon region and beyond, conquering tribe after tribe. Some submitted immediately, recognizing that resistance would only lead to crucifixion and enslavement, with no possibility of victory. Others fought and were destroyed, their warriors killed, their populations absorbed into the legion's slave class. Each conquest made the legion stronger. More warriors, more slaves, more territory, more resources. By 2255, less than a decade after Edward Sallow had been captured by the Blackfoots, Caesar's legion controlled enough territory that it needed an administrative center, a capital that could serve as the symbolic and practical heart of the growing empire. Caesar chose Flagstaff, a pre-war city in Arizona that had survived the Great War relatively intact. Flagstaff became Legion Rome, not literally, but symbolically. It was the city Caesar ruled from, the place where conquered tribal leaders came to submit, where the legion's administrative apparatus was centered. The city was transformed according to Caesar's vision. Pre-war buildings were repurposed as legion facilities. Streets were patrolled by legionaries rather than tribal warriors. Slaves built infrastructure and maintained order under the supervision of legion officers. The establishment of Flagstaff as capital marked the legion's transformation from a mobile army into something more complex, an actual state with territory to govern, populations to control, infrastructure to maintain. Caesar proved surprisingly capable at this administrative challenge. He created a hierarchy of officers and administrators, established supply systems to move resources from conquered territories to where they were needed, implemented laws that were harsh but consistent. The legion's legal system was simple. Obedience to Caesar and legion authority was mandatory. Resistance was punishable by death. Weakness or failure was not tolerated. There were no appeals, no rights, no protections for individuals against legion authority. But there was also, in legion-controlled territory, no raiding, no intertribal warfare, no banditry. The legion's absolute control created a brutal peace. You were either part of the legion or you were enslaved by it, but you weren't fighting a constant, chaotic struggle for survival. This appealed to some conquered peoples, particularly merchants and traders who found that legion roads were safe, that caravans could move through legion territory without being raided, that contracts and agreements were enforced by Caesar's authority. The legion created stability, even if that stability was built on slavery and terror. Throughout the late 2250s and into the 2260s, the legion continued expanding westward, pushing toward the Colorado River. This expansion brought them into increasingly sophisticated territory. Not just isolated tribes, but settled communities, trade networks, and eventually the periphery of NCR influence. Each conquest added to the legion's strength. More warriors, more slaves, more territory, more resources to fuel further expansion. Caesar's methods for incorporating conquered peoples evolved with experience. Initially, the legion had simply destroyed tribal leadership and absorbed populations. But as the legion grew larger and its conquests more distant from Flagstaff, Caesar developed more sophisticated approaches. Some conquered leaders were allowed to retain nominal authority if they submitted absolutely to legion oversight. Some tribes were incorporated as auxiliaries rather than full legionaries, given less trusted roles, but allowed to maintain some cultural identity in exchange for military service. This flexibility was purely pragmatic. Caesar had no sentimental attachment to conquered cultures. His goal remained their complete erasure and replacement with legion identity. But he was also intelligent enough to recognize that complete cultural annihilation took time, and that immediate total suppression might provoke rebellions that would be costly to suppress. Better to allow some temporary concessions, to make the transition gradual where immediate transformation would be impossible, and to achieve total legion cultural dominance over generations rather than years. The legion's military organization evolved during this period into a sophisticated system that drew from Roman models, but adapted them to wasteland reality. The basic unit was the cohort, roughly 80 to 100 warriors led by centurions who answered to higher officers. Multiple cohorts formed larger formations under praetors and legates. At the top of the military hierarchy stood the legate, initially Joshua Graham, later Lanius, who commanded the legion's armies under Caesar's ultimate authority. Legion training was brutal and began young. Boys taken from conquered tribes or born to legion slaves were raised in camps where they learned to fight, to follow orders without question, to endure pain and hardship without complaint. Weakness was not tolerated. Sick or injured trainees who couldn't keep up were killed rather than allowed to burden the legion. The training created warriors who were individually skilled, but more importantly, who could fight as coordinated units, who would hold formation under fire, who would follow suicidal orders without hesitation. This discipline gave the legion advantages that compensated for their technological limitations. Caesar deliberately restricted legion use of advanced technology, particularly energy weapons and most pre-war equipment. This wasn't superstition or ignorance. Caesar understood technology perfectly well. But he believed that reliance on technology created weakness, that warriors who depended on guns and energy weapons became soft, that true strength came from martial skill and the willingness to close with enemies in melee combat. So the legion fought with machetes and spears, with throwing weapons and firearms only for specific roles. They wore leather and sports equipment modified into armor rather than metal plates or combat armor. They relied on physical conditioning, tactical discipline, and absolute willingness to accept casualties to overcome enemies who had superior equipment but inferior organization and commitment. This approach worked remarkably well against most wasteland opponents. Tribal warriors and raiders, even when better armed, couldn't match legion discipline and tactical coordination. NCR forces, stretched thin and often poorly trained, found that their technological advantages meant little when legion cohorts closed to melee range and simply overwhelmed defensive positions through disciplined mass assault. By the early 2270s, the legion had conquered dozens of tribes and controlled territory stretching across Arizona and into parts of Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The western boundary of legion territory approached the Colorado River, beyond which lay the Mojave Wasteland and, crucially, Hoover Dam, the greatest pre-war infrastructure project in the region, recently restored to operation by the new California Republic. Caesar watched the NCR's expansion into Nevada with the attention of a predator studying prey. The Republic represented everything he despised about post-war civilization: democracy that elevated mediocrity, bureaucracy that slowed decision-making, individual rights that weakened collective strength. But the NCR also represented opportunity. They had infrastructure, industrial capacity, resources, and population. If the Legion could conquer the NCR, incorporating their capabilities with Legion discipline, the result would be unstoppable. Hoover Dam became Caesar's primary strategic objective. The dam controlled the Colorado River, which meant controlling water distribution throughout the entire region. It generated enormous amounts of electricity, powering NCR operations across the Mojave. It was also a natural choke point, a crossing of the Colorado that could serve as a gateway to California. Taking the dam would cripple NCR operations east of California, provide the Legion with resources to sustain a prolonged campaign, and demonstrate that the Legion could defeat the Republic's military forces in direct combat. But attacking the dam required preparation. The NCR had fortified their positions, brought in regular army troops to supplement militia forces, and established supply lines from California to support their Mojave operations. A simple frontal assault, even with Legion discipline and willingness to accept casualties, would be costly and might fail. Caesar needed intelligence about NCR defenses, needed to choose the right moment to strike, needed to ensure that when the Legion attacked, they would win decisively. The Legion spent the mid-2270s preparing for this assault. Caesar established forward positions along the eastern bank of the Colorado, built up supply caches, concentrated forces, and gathered intelligence through spies and scouts who infiltrated NCR territory. The Malpais legate, Joshua Graham, worked with Caesar to plan the assault, studying NCR defensive positions, identifying weaknesses, developing tactics that would maximize Legion's strengths while minimizing NCR advantages in firepower and defensive preparations. Caesar also refined his understanding of what conquering the NCR would mean. It wasn't enough to simply take Hoover Dam. That would be a tactical victory, but not strategic triumph. The Legion needed to break NCR military power in the Mojave, demonstrate that the Republic couldn't defend its eastern territories, and create conditions where the NCR's civilian population would lose faith in their government's ability to protect them. Only then could Caesar march into California itself and begin the process of destroying the Republic and incorporating its territories into the Legion. This vision of conquest went beyond simple military expansion. Caesar believed he was engaged in a dialectical process, thesis and antithesis producing synthesis. The Legion represented one extreme, absolute autocracy, rejection of technology and individualism. Society organized entirely around military strength. The NCR represented the opposite, democracy, technological reliance, individual rights prioritized over collective power. When the Legion conquered the NCR, Caesar believed the synthesis would be a society that combined NCR's industrial capacity with Legion discipline, creating something superior to either parent civilization. It was a grand vision, articulated in philosophical terms that drew from Caesar's readings in history and political theory. But it was also, in practice, a justification for conquest, slavery, and the destruction of a society that, whatever its flaws, had managed to create something resembling stable democracy in the post-war wasteland. Caesar's intellectual sophistication made him more dangerous than a simple warlord, but it didn't make his methods any less brutal or his vision any less monstrous to those who would be enslaved by it. In 2274, while Caesar prepared for war, the NCR signed the New Vegas Treaty with Robert House, securing control of Hoover Dam and McCarran Airport, while recognizing House's authority over the Strip. This treaty fundamentally altered the strategic situation. The NCR now had formal control over the dam and could dedicate resources to defending it without worrying about challenges to their authority from New Vegas. Caesar saw the treaty as both challenge and opportunity. The challenge was that NCR defenses would be stronger, more focused, backed by the Republic's full military and industrial capacity. The opportunity was that the NCR's commitment to holding the dam was now absolute. They couldn't retreat without abandoning their treaty obligations and losing face. If the Legion could defeat the NCR at Hoover Dam, it would be a blow from which the Republic might never recover. By 2277, 3 years after the treaty, both sides were ready. The NCR had fortified Hoover Dam, established strong points along the Colorado, and positioned forces to respond to Legion attacks from multiple directions. The Legion had massed cohorts on the eastern bank, assembled supplies for a prolonged campaign, and completed intelligence gathering that gave them detailed understanding of NCR defensive positions. Caesar gave the order, and Joshua Graham led the Legion across the Colorado in the First Battle of Hoover Dam. The battle plan was characteristically aggressive. Legion forces would strike at multiple points along the Colorado simultaneously, forcing NCR defenders to spread their forces. The main assault would target Hoover Dam directly, with waves of legionaries accepting horrific casualties to close with NCR defenders and negate their firepower advantage through melee combat. Once on the dam itself, Legion discipline and close-quarters combat skills would overwhelm NCR troops who were better equipped but less prepared for the brutal chaos of hand-to-hand fighting. The assault began with Legion forces crossing the Colorado under cover of darkness, using boats and makeshift bridges to get cohorts across the river. NCR defenders, alerted by scouts, opened fire, but the Legion had expected this and accepted the casualties as the price of getting forces across. Waves of legionaries reached the western bank, established footholds, and began pushing toward the dam and NCR positions. The fighting was intense from the beginning. NCR troops, dug in behind fortifications and equipped with superior firearms, inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Legion forces. But the Legion kept coming, replacing fallen warriors with fresh cohorts, maintaining pressure that prevented NCR forces from repositioning or bringing reserves to threatened areas. It was brutal attrition warfare, Legion bodies against NCR bullets, discipline against firepower. For days the battle raged, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The Legion captured some NCR positions, but couldn't break through to the dam itself. The NCR held their primary defensive lines, but couldn't drive Legion forces back across the Colorado. Casualties mounted on both sides. Legionaries died in waves trying to assault fortified positions. NCR troops were killed when Legion forces broke through weak points or flanked defensive lines. Joshua Graham, commanding from the front as was his practice, drove his forces forward with relentless determination. He understood that the Legion's advantage was their willingness to accept casualties that would break other armies, that they had to maintain offensive pressure regardless of losses, that hesitation or mercy would only prolong the battle and potentially turn it into a stalemate. But the NCR, desperate and defending what they knew was strategic vital ground, fought with unexpected resilience. They adapted to Legion tactics, concentrated fire on officers to disrupt Legion coordination, used their superior range and firepower to inflict casualties before Legion forces could close to melee range. And crucially, NCR commanders identified a weakness in the Legion's assault. Their forces were concentrated in narrow approach routes that left them vulnerable to concentrated fire and, potentially, to something more devastating. The NCR lured Legion forces into Boulder City, a town that commanded one of the main approaches to Hoover Dam. Legion cohorts, pursuing what appeared to be a retreating NCR force, moved into the town in strength. And then the NCR detonated explosives that had been positioned throughout Boulder City, specifically for this purpose, collapsing buildings and creating a massive explosion that annihilated the Legion forces caught in the trap. The Boulder City explosion was catastrophic for the Legion. Entire cohorts were destroyed in moments. The main thrust of the Legion assault was shattered, and the NCR, seeing their opportunity, counterattacked along the entire line, pushing Legion forces back toward the Colorado with coordinated assaults that exploited the chaos and disorganization caused by the explosion. The Legion, having lost their offensive momentum and taken unsustainable casualties, had no choice but to retreat. They fell back across the Colorado in disorder, pursued by NCR forces who inflicted additional casualties on the withdrawal. When the battle finally ended, the NCR held Hoover Dam, had secured the western bank of the Colorado, and had demonstrated that the Legion, for all its discipline and ferocity, could be defeated by a well-prepared and determined defense. The first battle of Hoover Dam was a decisive NCR victory, the kind of clear outcome that had strategic consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. The NCR had proven they could defend the Mojave against the Legion's best assault. The Legion had been stopped, pushed back, shown to be not invincible, but simply another army that could be defeated through superior tactics and willingness to fight. For Caesar, watching from Fortification Hill, the defeat was both shocking and infuriating. He had planned carefully, massed overwhelming force, committed his best legate and thousands of legionaries to the assault. And they had failed. Not barely. They had been decisively beaten, forced to retreat with massive casualties, made to look weak in front of the entire wasteland. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to be punished, not just as justice, but as a lesson to the entire Legion about the consequences of failure. Caesar's rage focused on Joshua Graham, the Malpais legate who had commanded the assault, who had led the Legion into the Boulder City trap, whose tactics had failed to overcome NCR defenses. The punishment was designed to be exemplary, to create a memory that would haunt the Legion and terrify its enemies. Caesar ordered Graham brought before him and the assembled Legion forces. In front of thousands of legionaries, Caesar pronounced judgment. Graham had failed, and failure was the ultimate sin against the Legion and its divine founder. Graham was coated in pitch, a thick, flammable substance that clung to his skin and clothing. Then he was set on fire, the pitch igniting immediately, engulfing him in flames that seared flesh and burned with heat that should have killed him in moments. And finally, still burning, Graham was thrown into the Grand Canyon, cast into the abyss as both execution and symbolic rejection, removed from the Legion, from life itself, cast down as an offering to Caesar's rage, and as a lesson about what happened to those who failed the Son of Mars. It should have been death. Every reasonable expectation, every understanding of what human bodies can endure said that Joshua Graham died in that moment, burned alive and then fallen hundreds of feet into the canyon below. The Legion recorded him as dead, executed for his failure at Hoover Dam. The Wasteland heard the story and assumed Graham had been killed, one more victim of Caesar's brutality. But Graham survived. Somehow, impossibly, he survived the fire and the fall and the injuries that should have been fatal. He became the burned man, a figure of legend who existed somewhere in the wasteland, horribly scarred, perhaps insane, perhaps transformed into something inhuman by pain and survival. The truth of what happened to Joshua Graham, of where he went and what he became passed into myth and rumor. Stories told in Legion territory about the legate who couldn't die. Warnings whispered about the burned monster who wandered the wasteland seeking vengeance or redemption. For Caesar and the Legion, Graham's survival or death was ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was the lesson his punishment conveyed. Failure was not tolerated. No rank or past service could protect you from Caesar's judgment, and the price of losing was worse than death. The execution, successful or not, served its purpose of reinforcing Caesar's absolute authority and the Legion's culture of victory or annihilation. With Graham gone, Caesar needed a new legate, someone who could command the Legion's military forces and restore the fear and respect that the Hoover Dam defeat had damaged. The choice he made revealed much about how the Legion had evolved and what Caesar valued in his commanders. Legate Lanius, known also as the Monster of the East, came from one of the tribes the Legion had conquered years earlier. His tribe had resisted Legion authority, refused to submit peacefully, fought back against Legion forces. The resistance had been brave but futile, and eventually the Legion crushed it, killing the tribal warriors and preparing to absorb the survivors into Legion society. But Caesar had been watching this particular conquest with interest, and he saw something in the young warrior who would become Lanius. When the conquered tribe's leaders were brought before Legion authorities, Lanius had done something extraordinary. He had taken responsibility for the resistance, claimed that he had urged the fighting, and then, to prove his worthiness to join the Legion, he had systematically killed every adult male in his own tribe, not in combat, not in defense, but as an offering to Caesar, a demonstration that Lanius valued Legion's strength over tribal loyalty. It was monstrous, appalling, the act of someone who had either completely embraced Legion ideology or had no moral constraints whatsoever. Caesar, characteristically, saw it as evidence of exceptional commitment and usefulness. Lanius was brought into the Legion, trained as a warrior, and given opportunities to prove himself in combat. And prove himself he did. Lanius demonstrated tactical brilliance, absolute fearlessness, and a willingness to use any method to achieve victory. He became known for his brutality even by Legion standards, crucifying not just enemies, but also legionaries who failed or retreated, accepting horrific casualties to take objectives, inspiring terror in opponents who heard that Lanius commanded the attacking force. His helmet, a distinctive piece that concealed his face, made him seem inhuman, a monster in steel who couldn't be bargained with or appealed to. When Caesar needed to replace Joshua Graham, Lanius was the obvious choice. He had proven himself in years of campaigns, demonstrated loyalty that went beyond simple obedience into something approaching worship of Caesar and Legion ideology, and possessed the kind of terrifying presence that could restore the Legion's reputation for invincibility. Caesar elevated Lanius to legate, gave him command of the Legion's military forces, and tasked him with preparing for a second assault on Hoover Dam. But before that second assault could be launched, the Legion needed to rebuild. The first battle had cost them thousands of legionaries, had damaged their reputation, had revealed weaknesses in their tactics and organization. Caesar spent the years after 2777 consolidating Legion control over existing territories, conquering additional tribes to replace losses, and analyzing what had gone wrong at Hoover Dam. The analysis was characteristically thorough. the Legion had underestimated NCR defensive preparations and tactical competence. They had concentrated forces in ways that made them vulnerable to mass casualty attacks like the Boulder City explosion. They had relied too heavily on frontal assault when the NCR's defensive positions favored that approach. These were problems that could be addressed through better intelligence, more flexible tactics, and more careful preparation. But there were also deeper issues that Caesar couldn't easily fix. The Legion's rejection of advanced technology meant they would always be outgunned by NCR forces. Their reliance on mass assault tactics meant accepting horrific casualties that, even with constant conquest bringing in new slaves and warriors, would eventually exhaust their manpower. And the Legion's entire structure depended on Caesar's personal authority. What would happen when he died? That last question became increasingly urgent as Caesar developed a brain tumor sometime in the late 2270s. The exact timing is unclear, but by 2281, the tumor was causing serious symptoms: debilitating headaches, occasional blackouts, moments of confusion and instability. Caesar understood better than most what this meant. Brain tumors in the wasteland without access to advanced medical technology were essentially death sentences. He was dying, slowly, and the Legion had no succession mechanism to ensure stability after his death. Caesar's response to his illness was characteristic. He ignored it when possible, concealed it when necessary, and continued planning for the conquest of Hoover Dam as if he would live forever. He couldn't show weakness, couldn't admit that the divine son of Mars was dying from something as mundane as disease. The Legion's entire ideology was built on strength, on the leader who was superior to ordinary humans, on Caesar as the transformative genius who would build an empire. Admitting that he was dying would undermine everything. So the tumor remained Caesar's secret, known to his personal physician and perhaps suspected by his closest advisors, but not acknowledged publicly. And Caesar pushed forward with preparations for the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, driven partly by strategic calculation, but also by the knowledge that this might be his last campaign, his final chance to achieve the conquest that would validate his entire project. During these years of rebuilding and preparation, Lanius led Legion forces in campaigns that conquered or destroyed at least 14 more tribes. These conquests served multiple purposes. They provided fresh warriors to replace losses from Hoover Dam. They demonstrated that the Legion remained dangerous despite the defeat, and they allowed Lanius to blood his forces and develop the tactical approaches that would be used in the second assault on the dam. The tribes conquered during this period faced the same choice all Legion victims faced: submit completely, accepting enslavement and cultural annihilation, or resist and be exterminated. Most submitted, recognizing that the Legion, even defeated at Hoover Dam, remained overwhelmingly powerful. A few resisted and were destroyed with exemplary brutality, their populations killed or enslaved, their territories absorbed, their names erased from wasteland memory. By the end of this period, the Legion claimed to have absorbed 86 tribes total, a staggering number that represented decades of conquest and cultural destruction. Whether that number was precisely accurate or inflated for propaganda purposes, it reflected a genuine empire, a massive territory controlled by Legion authority, a population of millions living under Caesar's rule. But the empire was also deeply problematic in ways that Caesar either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The legion's society was stratified in ways that created fundamental instabilities. Male warriors formed the privileged class, but they were a minority of the population. Women were enslaved, reduced to property, denied any agency or rights. Subject peoples lived under constant threat of crucifixion or collective punishment. The entire structure was held together by fear, by Caesar's personal charisma, and by the promise of continued conquest that would provide loot and glory for legionaries. What would happen when conquest stopped, when the legion ran out of tribes to conquer and had to govern stable territories? What would happen when Caesar died and the succession struggle began? What would happen when legionaries, raised to be warriors, had to become administrators and governors? These questions hung over the legion like Caesar's unreported tumor, problems that would eventually become crises if not addressed, but which addressing would require fundamental changes to legion ideology and structure that Caesar was unwilling to make. The legion's camp at Fortification Hill, established in the late 2270s as the staging ground for the second assault on Hoover Dam, represented the legion at its most organized and impressive. Thousands of legionaries were stationed there, living in ordered camps, training constantly, preparing for the battle that would determine the Mojave's future. Supply lines brought food, weapons, and equipment from legion territories across the Colorado. Officers drilled their cohorts, refined tactics, studied intelligence about NCR defensive positions. Caesar himself was present at Fortification Hill, commanding from what had been a pre-war military installation that the legion had fortified and transformed into their forward headquarters. From there, he could observe NCR positions across the river, could direct legion operations throughout the Mojave, could maintain the personal oversight of military operations that his leadership style required. The camp also hosted other legion facilities and personnel that revealed the organization's complexity. Frumentarii, legion spies and infiltrators operated from Fortification Hill, gathering intelligence from NCR territory, subverting potential allies, spreading propaganda about legion invincibility. Slave masters supervised the labor forces that maintained the camp and constructed fortifications. Merchants and traders who had been granted permission to operate in legion territory brought supplies and equipment, trading with an empire that officially despised commerce but pragmatically needed it. The presence of these non-military elements showed how the legion had evolved from a pure military organization into something more complex. They still identified as warriors first, still organized society around military hierarchy, still valued martial prowess above all else. But running an empire required logistics, intelligence gathering, administration, trade, all the civilian functions that pure military organizations lack. The Legion had developed these capabilities while maintaining the fiction that they were purely military, that everything served the ultimate purpose of conquest and glory. By 2281, 4 years after the First Battle of Hoover Dam, both the Legion and the NCR were ready for the second confrontation. The NCR had fortified their positions, brought in additional troops, and prepared for the assault they knew was coming. The Legion had rebuilt their strength, refined their tactics under Lanius's leadership, and massed forces at Fortification Hill. But the strategic situation had become more complex than a simple two-sided conflict. Robert House, ruling New Vegas from the Lucky 38, had his own interests in who controlled Hoover Dam and the Mojave. Various independent factions, the Boomers at Nellis, the Brotherhood of Steel in Hidden Valley, the Great Khans nursing grievances against the NCR, could potentially intervene or be recruited by one side or another. And somewhere in the wasteland, a courier who had been shot and left for dead was recovering, learning about the platinum chip and becoming a factor that none of the major powers had fully accounted for. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam, everyone understood, would be decisive. The NCR couldn't afford another victory that left the Legion intact and capable of future attacks. The Legion couldn't survive another defeat. Caesar's illness, though hidden, was worsening, and the Empire needed victory to maintain cohesion and morale. House needed the battle's outcome to preserve New Vegas's independence, whether that meant the NCR or Legion winning, or some outcome that weakened both sides. Caesar's plan for the second battle drew lessons from the first. Rather than a frontal assault on fortified positions, the Legion would use infiltration and deception. Frumentari had been positioning themselves in NCR territory for years, gathering intelligence and preparing for sabotage. The assault would come from multiple directions, forcing NCR forces to spread their defenses. And crucially, the Legion would target NCR leadership and communications, trying to create chaos that would allow Legion forces to exploit gaps in the defensive line. Lanius would lead the assault, bringing the terror of the monster of the East to bear against NCR defenders who had heard stories about the new legate and what he did to enemies and subordinates alike. The legate's reputation was itself a weapon. NCR troops, who knew Lanius commanded the attacking force, might break more easily, might retreat rather than face the certainty of brutal death if captured. But the plan also revealed the Legion's fundamental limitations. They were still relying on mass assault, accepting horrific casualties, counting on discipline and ferocity to overcome technological disadvantages. They had learned from the Boulder City disaster, but they hadn't fundamentally changed their approach because Caesar's ideology didn't allow for that kind of change. The Legion was what it was. A military autocracy built on Roman models, effective at conquest, but potentially unsuited for the challenges of governing an empire or adapting to opponents who understood their methods. The Legion's internal tensions were also building toward crisis. With Caesar's illness worsening, various factions within the Legion were positioning themselves for the inevitable succession struggle. Lanius commanded the loyalty of the military, but he was a blunt instrument, terrifying, but not particularly sophisticated. Vulpes Inculta, master of the Frumentari, represented a more subtle approach to power, using intelligence and manipulation rather than brute force. Lucius, commander of Caesar's Praetorian Guard, controlled the forces most loyal to Caesar personally and might claim to be implementing Caesar's will after his death. These divisions were manageable while Caesar lived and commanded absolute authority. But they represented fracture lines that would become chasms when Caesar died. And Caesar knew this, which added urgency to his plans for Hoover Dam. If the Legion could conquer the NCR before he died, if they could achieve the victory that would give them California's resources and industry, then the succession might not matter. The empire would be strong enough, rich enough, successful enough to survive internal power struggles. If the Legion failed at Hoover Dam again, if Caesar died before achieving the conquest that justified his entire ideology, then the empire he had built through 20 years of brutal conquest might simply collapse into warring factions, each claiming to represent the true Legion, each fighting others for control of the territories and slaves that Caesar had accumulated. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam, then, wasn't just another military campaign. It was an existential test for the Legion, a moment when everything Caesar had built would be validated or destroyed. Victory would mean vindication, proof that Caesar's methods worked, that the Legion's brutal discipline and rejection of pre-war values was the path to lasting civilization. Defeat would mean collapse, the revelation that the Legion was just another warlord's empire, held together by charisma and violence, doomed to disintegrate when the founder died. In 2281, as all the various forces converged on the Mojave, the Legion stood poised between triumph and annihilation. They were powerful. 86 tribes conquered, thousands of disciplined legionaries ready to die for Caesar, territory stretching across the eastern wasteland. But they were also fragile, dependent on one man's leadership, built on unsustainable conquest, structured around an ideology that offered no mechanism for peaceful transition or democratic legitimacy. The story of Caesar's Legion, then, is the story of autocracy's power and its ultimate inadequacy. Caesar had proven that a brilliant, ruthless individual could conquer vast territories, could impose order on chaos, could build an empire through force of will and careful application of historical lessons. The Legion demonstrated that discipline and organization could triumph over better armed but less coordinated opponents, that absolute authority could create stability, even if that stability was built on slavery and terror. But the Legion also demonstrated autocracy's fatal weaknesses. With no legitimate succession mechanism, Caesar's empire would likely collapse when he died. With no flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances, the Legion would struggle when conquest ended and governance began. With no foundation beyond fear and force, the empire offered nothing that would outlast the military power that sustained it. The wasteland had seen warlords before Caesar, and it would see them after. But Caesar was unique in his sophistication, his ideology, his attempt to build something more permanent than a typical raider empire. He had read history, understood the patterns of rise and fall, believed he could create an empire that would avoid the mistakes of the past. His tragedy, and the Legion's, was that understanding history wasn't enough to transcend it, that brilliance couldn't overcome the fundamental problems of building a civilization on slavery and conquest. As the Second Battle of Hoover Dam approached, Caesar's Legion represented a dark possibility for the wasteland's future. That autocracy might triumph over democracy, that brutal efficiency might overcome messy freedom, that Rome's empire might be reborn in the Mojave. It was a possibility that terrified the NCR, intrigued Robert House, and appealed to some wasteland survivors who valued order over rights, stability over freedom. Whether that dark possibility would be realized or rejected, whether the Legion would conquer the Mojave or collapse into the wasteland's chaos, would be determined not just by military force, but by the choices of individuals whose actions could tip the balance. The courier, recovering from Benny's assassination attempt and learning about the forces converging on Hoover Dam, would become one of those individuals. But there were others, NCR commanders who would decide whether to hold or retreat, Legion officers who would choose loyalty or ambition, independent factions who would decide which side to support or oppose. The beauty and terror of the Mojave in 2281 was that the outcome wasn't predetermined, that human choice still mattered, that even an empire as powerful as the Legion could be stopped by determined resistance and strategic calculation. Caesar had built something formidable, something that would be remembered whether it triumphed or fell. But he couldn't control the future completely, couldn't eliminate the human variables that made history unpredictable. The bull standard of the Legion flew over Fortification Hill, visible from across the Colorado, a symbol of conquest and terror that had made dozens of tribes submit or die. Whether that standard would fly over Hoover Dam and eventually over all of California remained to be seen. But the possibility was real, the threat genuine, the stakes absolute. Caesar's Legion had transformed Edward Sallow's intellectual insights into a terrifying reality. An empire built on Roman models, sustained by slavery, expanded through conquest, held together by one man's charisma and vision. It was autocracy refined to brutal efficiency, ideology backed by military power, history weaponized in service of domination. The Wasteland would remember the Legion regardless of what happened at Hoover Dam. They would remember the crucifixions, the enslavement, the erasure of tribal identities. They would remember Caesar as one of the post-war world's most remarkable and monstrous figures, a man who had transformed himself from a captured follower into an emperor, who had built an empire from nothing, who had proven that knowledge and ruthlessness could reshape the wasteland. But they would also remember that empires fall, that autocrats die, that power built solely on force is ultimately fragile. The Legion's story was unfinished, its ending unwritten, its fate dependent on the same kind of human unpredictability that had shaped the wasteland since the bombs fell. The House might always win, as Robert House believed. But Caesar's Legion demonstrated a different truth, that empires rise and fall, that conquest is easier than governance, that building something lasting requires more than just military victory and ideological purity. Whether Caesar understood that truth, whether he had time to address it before his tumor, or the NCR, or simple human resistance, destroyed what he had built, remained to be seen. The Legion marched toward its destiny at Hoover Dam, disciplined and terrible, carrying the hope and terror of autocracy triumphant. The bull's standard advanced, and the wasteland waited to see whether that advance would continue into California or be broken forever on the Colorado River's western bank. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would provide the answer, and that answer would shape not just the Mojave's future, but the wasteland's understanding of what was possible, what was sustainable, what kind of civilization could emerge from the nuclear fire that had destroyed the old world. Caesar's Legion stood ready, 86 tribes forged into one brutal instrument of conquest, waiting for the order that would send them across the Colorado one more time. Whether they would return victorious or be destroyed in the attempt, whether Caesar's vision would be vindicated or revealed as monstrous delusion, whether the bull or the bear would dominate the Mojave, these questions hung over the wasteland like the radiation that still poisoned the desert. The Legion had proven it could conquer. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam would determine if it could triumph, If autocracy could overcome democracy, if Caesar's Rome could be reborn in America's radioactive ashes. The answer was coming. The wasteland waited, and the Legion prepared to write the final chapter of its story in blood and conquest, as it always had, as Caesar had taught them, as the bull demanded.